Hey, Seminole family. Thank you for joining us for today's video devotion. Today I want to talk about how we can all reach out like Jesus did. And there's 4 questions I want us to talk about asking ourselves. What is it like to be like Jesus with people who are far from God? Here are some characteristics of Christ reaching out to others using different parts of the body. We can ask ourselves each of these questions to see if our lives are aligned with Jesus' life. First question, does my heart care about what God's heart cares about? I believe the most important problem when it comes to reaching out as fully devoted followers of Christ is a heart problem. Sometimes the truth is our heart gets cold. Sometimes we find it easier to stay in our own little bubble and not take risks, to not exert the effort or the energy that's involved in getting to know somebody who is far from God. Sometimes we just focus on our own convenience and our own comfort. So maybe some of us need to pray and ask God, God, give us a heart for the lost like Jesus had. Help us love people who are far from you. The second thing we have to ask ourselves is, do my feet take me where Jesus' feet took him? Well, where did Jesus' feet take him? They took him to people who are far from God all the time. His feet took him where the Pharisees' feet would never take them, to parties at tax collectors' houses, to dinners attended by prostitutes, to the country of Samaria, where a respectable religious leader would never go, even to lepers. Those are just some of the people that Jesus' feet took him to. Jesus' feet got him in some serious trouble. When Jesus was called Friend of the Sinners, we think of that as a great title, but it was not intended that way. This was meant to be a slam, a term of hostility. You're the friend of sinners. Jesus was with them and he loved them. And the Pharisees hated Jesus and hated his feet. There's a wonderful verse in Isaiah 52:7. It says, how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news of peace and salvation, the good news that God reigns. How beautiful are the feet of those who come with the gospel. Jesus' feet were so beautiful to the people who were far from God that one day, a woman who thought she was lost beyond hope gave her greatest treasure to anoint those feet. She bathed them with her tears, and she dried them with her hair, because those feet brought Jesus to her. For most of us, this doesn't mean that you have to start going to new places. For most of us, this means that we just need to start forming relationships and being intentional in the circles that we already find ourselves. If your kids are in the soccer years of life, you've got a great opportunity. You can find out a lot about a person's spiritual condition and somebody's heart just by watching how they respond to their children playing soccer. You can cultivate friendships and strike up a meaningful conversation about family and parenting just by caring for the people that you're already involved in life with. It'll look different for everybody, but it really is possible. You can really have feet like Jesus' feet. You can have feet that take you to where people are far from God because they're all over the place. The third question we've got to ask ourselves is, do my hands extend service to the people that Jesus' hands served? Jesus' hands were constantly extended in service to people who didn't yet know the Father. In Mark chapter 1, there's a wonderful story where a leper approaches Jesus. The man asked to be made clean. Now, the law was real strict about lepers. They couldn't have any contact with non-lepers. In fact, they had to cry out, unclean, unclean, and they had to go to the opposite side of the road if someone was approaching them. They had to stay outside of the village. If they even touched someone else's house, it was supposed to be torn down because it was considered to be so unclean. Nobody could come within 10 feet of a leper. Isn't that interesting in our current situation? With this leper, he comes up to Jesus and he says, "Would you make me clean?" Jesus doesn't turn away. He reaches out his hand and he touches this man who had not been touched for who knows how many years. Not by his children, not by his spouse. Now, Jesus didn't have to do that. He could have just spoken a word. But he reached out with his hand and he touched the man and he said, "Be clean." Interestingly, not only was Jesus not infected by the guy's leprosy, it was the other way around. Jesus was so full of life and health that he infected the leper with his life. Jesus was more contagious with the life of the kingdom than the leper was with his disease. You know, if the Spirit of God lives inside you, you're like that. We fear sin sometimes, and rightly so in proper proportions because it is a fearsome thing. But I'll tell you what, sin is not nearly as contagious as the life of the kingdom of God, not nearly. Jesus just kept extending his hand, healing lepers, touching children, washing feet, clasping his hands in prayer, asking the Father to give him every life of every man and woman he could, till the very end of his life, when they took a nail in each hand for the sake of every sinner that ever lived. So take a look at your hands in this moment. How often are they extended to serve someone who is far from God? Maybe you have a neighbor that you could cut their grass or do an errand for. Maybe there's somebody at work who feels discouraged. And these hands, they could write them a note. They could send them a text. Touch their heart. Well, finally, the last question I want us to consider is a hard one. Does my mouth say what Jesus' mouth would say? I just want to give you one tip in terms of speaking with folks who are far from God. Early on in your relationship with them, it's a great idea to drop some clues or some hints about your spiritual commitment. Here's what happens. Sometimes Christians end up in a relationship with an unchurched, unbelieving acquaintance for years, but they never mention their faith. And eventually, they kind of go into avoidance mode because they're embarrassed because I've never talked about this for like years. So the helpful thing to do is to just drop some hints or some clues early on in your relationship about your spiritual commitment. Easiest way to do this, I've never yet met someone who was offended when I asked them this. Best thing you can do is just say to somebody, "Hey, do you mind if I pray for you about that?" It's a real simple thing. You hear about a need in their situation, about something with their kids or their parents or their siblings or their work project, and you just offer, "Hey, do you mind if I pray about that?" Or maybe mention, "Hey, I'm involved with this church. It's real meaningful to me." You don't have to go into a full-fledged gospel presentation. You're just dropping some clues about your commitment. So later, the door's always open. You're able to go through that. Listen, Jesus, he was always concerned about people who are far from God. With his heart, with his feet, with his hands, with his mouth. This is a great time for us to be just as concerned about those who are far from God. Hey, as we go through this time together, I want you to know that I am praying for you, that I love you. I hope you'll join us again sometime. Have a great day.